Hi, everybody, and we're back for another episode of Wedgie Talk, where I chat with some of the coolest people in the community about their fetish, wedgies, and everything in between, almost, as I guess anime panties might put it. But today's episode, I have a very special guest, a very good friend of mine, someone I play D&D with regularly, sometimes win campaigns that have a lot of wedgies, and sometimes ones that are very deep into world building, which I think might be a theme of our talk today. But a talented writer who's reached 100 watchers on DeviantArt, more than 16,000 page views on that platform, and whose stories on Lucky Fish forums consistently rack up thousands of views in every chapter and post. My good friend ChaosReacon. It's great to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, so for people, because many, I'm sure, know who you are, especially if they're on Lucky Fish forums. But for those who maybe don't, who are on DeviantArt or maybe are a bit newer to the community, do you want to just sort of introduce yourself, tell people a bit about your work and who you are in the community and some of what you're maybe known for?
Well, I will at least explain for what few members do recognize me for, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I got started at least within the community with a little series of mine called Chatoru's Alchemy Trials, which at the beginning of it, I really came up with the plot with it, but I had very special help with Puppy Dog and Skern Warrior.
Mm-hmm.
But sadly, as the writers got busy with their lives, I eventually took up the torch of learning how to write it myself and continued that starting as of 2015.
Yeah, so you start in 2015 writing that story, and Chatoru's Alchemy Trials is one I think we'll definitely talk about a fair bit, because I think it might be fair to say it's your magnum opus, certainly one of the longest stories, I think, in the Wedgie Fetish community, and definitely one with the most depth, I think, in a lot of ways. But so where do you go from there? You start writing in 2015, you're saying you sort of have to learn how to write that. So what's that process like? You're learning how to write it, and then where do you go from there? What's next for you after that?
Well, originally I started thinking that I would just be a lot better as a artist than a writer, but eventually it just came about well, reading some of the other great stories that were part of the different communities, such As You Wish by As You Wish by Jack.
Mm-hmm.
I'm constantly forgetting the numbers.
Check 538, right?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or as easier name to recognize him, Alistair Cade.
Yes, yes.
So that was definitely a big inspiration, and definitely Puppy Dog's works with such stories as Val the Vampire, May and Connie, and then other series like the Wedgie Academy that I think was on the Wedgie board before everything got moved over to Lucky Fish after the board went down, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, you're totally right. And yeah, the DA user, very popular DeviantArt user, was the one who moved that particular story over. I think the board got populated just by people moving over stories that they liked and things, people saving them. They weren't sort of automatically moved or anything, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Where some of the some works did get lost in it. Where I know that the last chapter of it was another one of Jack's Squad Neko, I think it was called.
Okay.
Wedgie Squad Neko. I think it was like the last chapter that didn't get saved.
Okay. So interesting. So, like you're saying, the interesting thing about you too is that, unlike some of the other people I've chatted with and just a lot of other writers in general, you've also been doing a lot of art as well, and you've sort of built out your stories with the art as well. So for you, did you sort of start more as a writer, or did you start as an artist, or how did those two things sort of come together in your work?
It was more with art to begin with, where start drawing since I was young, and people may call me a furry for this, but it was mainly Sonic the Hedgehog, like part of the original adventure games that I really like the art style of, and I tried to mimic that style.
Mm-hmm.
And it did take me a little while longer before I finally got into drawing humans and all that kind of stuff. And so, for the longest time, it was mainly just trace and get my style better with whatever anime series that I liked at the time, Naruto, One Piece, then whichever series that I happened to be watching at the time. But yeah, back then I was definitely more the artist than the writer, which hence I had the idea for Chatoru's Alchemy Trials, or as it was mainly known in my head at the time, was God's Divine.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily, I managed to get some help with Puppy Dog and Skirn Warrior in terms of helping ride out the plots that I had in my head.
Nice. So a fascinating start, and I think pretty different for a lot of writers as well. So when you say that, just to clarify, so you had, I guess, did you mean like visuals of the characters? You had ideas of, was it like the band God's Divine? You knew what they would look like, and how did the sort of working with Puppy Dog and Scrim Warrior come about from that?
It was someone that was definitely a part of the community a lot more than I was. But essentially, they asked if they could write a Wedgie version of my God's Divine characters, which I had for the most part the ideas that I have of them now. For the most part, Chaos still went through quite a bit of changes.
Yeah.
Since the initial idea back then.
For sure.
But no, they asked if they could write a Wedgie version, and I said, well, sure, go ahead. And they realized that they couldn't write either, but they really want to push the series out there to get more eyes on it, and they asked if anyone else would have been interested in helping write, while I gave them the plot ideas for what the episode and chapters would be about. And Puppy Dog was one of the first ones to respond, and met some of the other people in the community that way.
Nice. Yeah, it's funny how these things come together. Cool to see that sort of collaborative effort to get the story off the ground, and now years later you're sort of spearheading the writing of the story, which is fascinating too.
Mm-hmm.
And to take a step back from that, just to sort of go back, you mentioned sort of how you got into writing and artistry as well. But before we get too much into the stories and some of your writing as well, I'd like to, if we can, go back and talk about how your fetish began for you. If you can sort of take us back to that and trace its origins.
Well, with that, it was a rather simple one. I was about 10 or so, and received a wedgie from one of my cousins, and for whatever came of my autistic mind back then, just went, this feels good, give me another. Probably freaked him out, but at the same time, I'm like, I shouldn't have done that. But on the other hand, it's like, this is nice.
Yeah. So fascinating. A pretty tight story, pretty short, but I think it sort of captures something interesting about how it just sort of clicked for you right there. And from that, were there any experiences of sort of realizing you wanted to start doing art that was more sort of wedgie focused, or writing that was more wedgie focused, or did you just sort of drift into the community? God's divine characters sort of came up, and that transition that you mentioned of getting in touch with the other writers.
Well, in that regards, I am a pretty introverted, and so I pretty much read the stories and looked at the pictures and didn't really have much of an online presence at the time. And so it was just slowly easing myself in with someone else wanting to do the whole story thing before Puppy Dog and all that came along.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, and it's interesting that you sort of mentioned the sort of working with them, and sort of coming up with plot ideas, but having them sort of do the writing. So I guess the thing I'm curious about, why did you first start writing yourself and sort of take that leap away from sort of working with others to say you wanted to create your own stories? What was the motivation behind that?
Repeat the question one more time.
It's basically just, why did you first start writing in general?
Okay, the writing itself.
Yeah, writing
Uh,
and moving into wedgie stories. Why did you start writing those after working with Puppy Dog and Scream Warrior, sort of giving them plot ideas? Why then transition into writing yourself?
well, the original inspiration was well, I just had these ideas of these fictional characters, uh, and want to tell a grand epic story. But at the time, still being late middle school, early high school, not fully having full confidence in my own abilities, decided to going, well, I have the plot ideas. Might as well try and see if I could actually find someone who could actually write out the story and just learn from what they were able to help, and started looking more at the stories that I enjoyed more critically of why did I like them and what do I want to see out of my own series. But in terms of getting into writing the Wedgie stories themselves, part of it was due to, well, the other writers have their own lives and their own series that they want to continue. And it was about time for me to actually start sharing the ideas that I saw in my head instead of just trying to convey to someone else for them to interpret what I was seeing.
I like that. That's very well said, Chaos, I think. Very well said, sort of taking that step to show them what you were seeing, I think, which is awesome. And you mentioned in the beginning of that answer the idea of creating these sort of epic stories. And I think this is something that your work is definitely known for, having a lot of depth, as I mentioned before. And you create such detailed worlds, I'd say. And I remember once someone commented on Chatoru's Alchemy Trials, one of the later chapters, I think, and they sort of critiqued you on some of that depth. They were like, I just want more wedgies. I want less story. You have epic demon battles, and you have all this other great stuff that a lot of people were into, right? But so I'm curious to know for you, like, when you're writing these stories, like, how important is it that they have a lot more than just wedgies, that they do have a lot of backstory, that they maybe don't have all that many wedgies, that's really a story full of all this epic scope and stuff? Like, what was that like? Is that, how important is that to you?
Well, ultimately, I think it comes down to what do I prefer in a story where, of course, there is the fetish side of things. And it does work for a lot of series, like you would get May and Connie, where that's more of a slice of life, where it's what's happening to the two roommates and such. Where then there's a lot of the stories that I enjoyed, like Tengen Toppan, Gurren Lagann, and a bunch of other different anime series that I was watching at the time that just had this grander scope to it. And it's like I really enjoy that story focus to it, so that it's not just, oh, it's just the fetish. Here we go, and let's see what adventure we have next time. Where it can definitely work, but I definitely, especially since it was based off of my original ideas for God's Divine, I'm like, well, wedgies are part of real life, so why not add the story and the fetish aspect together?
Nice. Well said, for sure. And I guess just to sort of step away, we've mentioned a lot of Chatoru's Alchemy trials, but you've been busy with some other work, some stories I think have been doing very well, like Tales of the Wasteland for one, for example. So do you want to give people an idea of sort of what your stories are about, what they can expect from your writing, and just an idea of some of the stories that you've been writing? And you mentioned starting with Chatoru's Alchemy trials, but what have you sort of been writing, and how would you say it's sort of changed over time?
Well, the easiest way to kind of explain my writing style is that most of my series, if not all of them that I currently have out, are a connected universe in some shape, way, or form.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, it's then basically who is the protagonist of the story, or what type of story am I trying to tell? Am I wanting to tell the hero's journey, or am I playing around with the idea of this individual with psionic powers, as she literally just almost dances around almost all the problems that she ever experiences, with experiencing the same hardships as it is to outlive everyone, or if she doesn't have her skills in check. But otherwise, it's for the most part, especially with Tales of the Wasteland, it's someone that also has the fetish, and what's something that they're gonna do during their off time while they're traversing this wasteland of a world.
Yeah, so definitely some scope, it sounds like. Definitely some breadth to some of the stories you're telling, and keeping that, as you mentioned, almost epic scope through a shared universe, which is very interesting as well, I think. So I'm curious to know as well, uh, as someone who's written a lot, in terms of advice you maybe have for creators who are aspiring to write, maybe don't know where to start, or maybe they have grand ideas but aren't sure how to execute on them. What advice would you say you have for aspiring creators?
Biggest advice that I can give: put the ideas down. Doesn't matter if it's just a scene or if it's a handful of ideas of what you would want to see. Put them down regardless of if they need to be refined later. Just get the ideas down, because eventually you might lose that hard piece, and you'll want to make sure that you actually have some of those ideas down, so that you can maybe come back to them later, or just even share the ideas with someone you would like to bounce ideas off of. Because RPs are definitely another way to kind of get into it, of how to build your own character and how they would interact with others.
Nice. Well said, for sure. Something I'm curious about too, to sort of take it back a step to Tales of the Wasteland. You mentioned the protagonist there, and the character Chaos, who, with a very similar name, who you mentioned sort of changed over time. One thing that's interesting is the character of Chaos. There's something interesting in that I'm not sure if this might be how you describe them, but they're sort of a non-binary character, right? They sort of move between two different beings who are two different genders.
Okay.
You know, you know who I'm talking about. So I'm curious to know, like, does that at all, like, where did that idea come from?
Talking about Ghost and Joshi, or
Yes, yes.
ChaosReacon as his name would be. In
Where
that
do
case,
you?
that was never the thought for me, because essentially how that idea worked was Joshi was a female version of me, of how I kind of viewed myself if I was.
Okay.
And so definitely not thinking of it as, oh, are they non-binary? Are they transgender? It was no, it was the female persona of this individual, which it will have to be explained later as to exactly how that even came to be, but it's essentially the ghost being the main host of the body, where Joshi is then a living persona that, as time goes on, as the for instances the Black Rogue, you will unfortunately see less of the ghost and more of Joshi, mainly because, well, the one persona wants to experience life, where the other one's like, I'm fine if you want to take the main seat.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting from our talking here. It seems like anime's been a big influence in your writing. It sounds like you sort of taken some ideas and inspiration from that, as well as other stories that you mentioned. So I'm curious to know, from all that, what would you say a good Wedgie story needs to have to sort of be worth reading for you and be a successful story?
Oh, I wish I had a better answer for this, as it's been quite a while since I've read many other stuff, mainly because of life and all that.
Yeah.
But biggest things is the characters themselves. Where, sure, there have been plenty of good stories where it's just one and done, and that it's just some way of that somehow they're in a situation, whether if it's through some form of amnesia or hypnosis. But I find the the longer stories to catch my attention a lot more, and it will have to be like within the first few chapters of if it will keep my attention.
Mm-hmm.
But it ultimately depends on what type of genre the reader's ultimately aiming for. Where, well, there have definitely been some where I've been just set for the kind of young love type of stories.
Sure. And is there anything you're looking for in particular when you're sitting down to read a story? I know you mentioned you haven't been doing a lot of that, but when you do read, is there something you need to see in the first few chapters that will hook you, or is it that simple?
Um, Ultimately, it's the idea of, is it is it able to convince me that what's being said is actually being genuine?
Mm-hmm.
I I would have to describe it that way, because there are definitely moments where you can definitely take the moments of disbelief of why such things are happening. Um, yeah, a little harder to put my thumb on it, but other series that I would recommend if people haven't read them yet would be Soar Winner,
Mm,
or anything else by Anti Cherry,
yeah.
or if he's going by a different name at this point.
Yeah, he's gone by Vinny on Wedgie Haven, but I
There we
think
go.
Anti Cherry 93, I believe it is on DeviantArt. But yeah, no, interesting to hear, and I think you make some very interesting points there as well, which I think is really cool. Something I wanted to ask you about too. I think we've chatted about this before. You've mentioned the sort of hope and the idea of getting your story, I guess Chatoru's Alchemy Trials, if I'm correct, getting that adapted and getting maybe a cast of voice actors to sort of play the characters. Do you have any updates on maybe if that's something that we could expect in the future, or any dreams maybe outside of that for your content, like what you'd love to see happen to it in the future?
At this point, it's mainly a dream because at some point I would love to be able to have it animated, but with how long it takes me to do my drawings and how much it would actually take to animate, it it would almost be better if it was done as a drama audio tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but otherwise, something else that could work out, because unfortunately, some of these projects will take time and money, as it does take a lot of work and some of the talent that is required for some of this can't work for free. Everyone's got to pay bills and such.
Yeah.
But something that could still work out is essentially a storyboard style video where I have a basic idea of what's going on in the scene and then have the voice lines going over top of that. But sadly, at this point, it's merely a dream at this point.
That's okay. Sometimes dreams are good. Gives you something to maybe work toward in the future, which is interesting. And it'd be curious to see how that will work out, because obviously Chatoru's Alchemy Trials is this massive, massive story, right? So how much would you end up storyboarding to tell, which is an interesting question, I think, too. But I think that's something to work towards if you could see potential for it. And I think that would be interesting to see it in that format for sure. And I'm curious to know, sort of, beyond that as well, you mentioned that maybe something in the future. What else is next for you? Do you have any new stories you're working on or anything you're cooking now that we can maybe expect in the future from you?
So many ideas. Where definitely some of them being I need to finish up the Black Rogue and potentially what additions I will add on to that series. Maybe bring in some of my beloved D&D characters that I've been having so much fun with in this last year with. Definitely a continuation with Chatoru's Alchemy Trials once I finally get the all the chapters and episodes finally updated where yeah, thank you Grammarly and read out loud feature on Microsoft Word. Because oh boy, going back and just listening to it, it's like, oh boy, there is so much to be desired here.
Wow.
So yeah, there's definitely a lot of Chatoru's Alchemy Trials to still come. A lot more once I finally get around to it.
Nice, nice.
And definitely a few stories here and there with them, with Tales of the Wasteland.
Awesome.
Sitting on an idea, don't know if it's going to be an extra episode or if it's going to be more the epilogue or the finale story to that series.
Yeah. No, that's exciting stuff. And something I'm curious about too, because yeah, unlike, and we touched on this a bit, but unlike the other writers I mentioned, you're one of the only ones who is an artist as well, creating your own art. And I'm curious to know, do you have a preference, something you prefer doing, art or writing? I know you mentioned in the past it would have been art, but has that changed at all for you?
Writing is definitely the easier of the two, where not saying that I wouldn't want to do art. It's just the time investment where the story is easier to get down than the hours that it takes to put into an art piece. And especially at this point, the many art skills that I still need to learn. Oh, those backgrounds.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. And something else I wanted to touch on as well. You've obviously, like you said, been around in the community for a while. And now you're also an admin on Lucky Fish forums. So you've definitely sort of earned a place there, I think, within the community. So I'm curious to know what you think about the community in general. How have you maybe seen it change, or what do you sort of think of it overall in the years that you've been here that you maybe want to bring up?
Well, with that in particular, I didn't start getting too involved, or at least interacting with the community as much as I would have liked to back then.
Okay.
It was more of members like I'm trying to remember how the username actually goes. Chumeyu
Yeah, Chumeyogi. Yeah.
There we go. He was definitely a big individual who has brought me in, and then ultimately it was also the search for feedback whenever I would release something of, well, am I doing something good or not?
Yeah.
In terms of the community, it's, well, with any community, it's definitely been highs and lows where just the many different things that many different members have created, such as yourself, all the different video production, content creators, all the different artists and writers as well, and just coming together like for the last few years with the Wedgie awards and all
Yeah.
that.
And you've been nominated a few times, which is awesome.
And have yet to win any of them, if I'm right.
That's all right. None of us can beat Ceceda for best writer, but we'll keep trying.
And then, yeah, unfortunately, there are several lows, as some members do get it into their heads that they're a lot more bigger than they actually think they are, or it may not even be that, but there are some aspects to some members where they need to grow up a little bit more and fail to do so, and then whatever it is of how they act was more harmful to the community than it was doing good, unfortunately. And we have definitely seen a great loss to some of the members due to that.
Yeah.
And admittedly, because of some drama, it almost made me want to stop at some point.
Could you go a bit more into that? Sort of what sort of drama that might have been for people who maybe aren't familiar with how the community can be?
At this point, I don't want to go into specifics, mainly
Sure.
because there have definitely been people that have held grudges against me for some of the things that I have said or what they interpreted for me to say, or to the point of, oh, you said I should leave Demon Art, and it's like, if you actually listen to what I said, we gave you your options for the problem that you were complaining about. But no, it turned into, oh, he told me to leave DeviantArt, and it's like, no.
Yeah.
And especially at that point, I definitely enjoyed that person's Fire Emblem stories at the time, but just seeing how some of those types of users interact, and it's like, I want to enjoy your content, but seriously, get some help. Get some help in the fact that listen to feedback when you're asking for it, and don't just expect everything to go your way.
Yeah.
Or to like what feedback people will give you if you're gonna complain about it.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think without going into specifics, like you said, I think it's good for people to know that, sort of like you were saying, there's highs and lows, and there's some people who you might not get along with, and that can cause a lot of trouble and drama, I think, as well, which can be tough in the community as well. But overall, is there anything you really like about the community, or anything you think could maybe be changed and improved going forward?
One of the biggest things I would like to see change is currently the best word to kind of go with it, but if for those that are real sticklers about rules and that kind of stuff, make it objective instead of just subjective, vague rules. because now there's been how many issues that have started because, oh, this is how I think of it, and it's like, well, now you just make the entire group look very hypocritical from how you now judged whose ever's work. And so really it's mainly just just talk. Don't just simply walk away from the discussion, where there are definitely people out there that want to resolve these issues. Don't just walk away, and especially if you're taking like a higher position within the group in organizing stuff.
Yeah.
Well, you're part of that. You gotta be open to communicating, otherwise you're only just gonna give a worse impression of you when you're not telling people, well, what am I doing wrong? Why is my submission being denied? You're not giving me a reason. And I've definitely met several users that have been affected by this, and it's like, I don't understand what I'm even doing wrong. And it's like, okay, well, there's a reason why people are trying to submit to these groups, is so that they can get learning experience, or at least the exposure, so that people can actually give them the feedback that these creators are wanting.
Yeah, I think it's well said. And I know some groups on DeviantArt, which I believe is what you're referring to. Yeah, some of them, there can be some rules for getting content in. I know some people have had some struggles in the past to get past the rules, like you said, or to get content in when it's believed to be good and it doesn't meet certain standards, which is always difficult, right? When you're creative and you put a lot of time and yourself into a work, it can be hard to get any sort of rejection, especially if you feel like it's not explained well enough, if you're not given enough reason for why it isn't, and not enough feedback, like you said, on how to improve. So I think that's definitely an interesting point you bring up for sure.
Yeah, and exactly. Where the only thing to really add on top of that is, like, if you're part of a group, then talk with your group so that there's an understanding amongst everyone, instead of it being more of a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
Because sure, the one person may be more active, but at the same time, well, now it defeats the purpose of having a group if it's only the one person's subjective view, then what other people want to see part of the group.
Yeah. And speaking of groups, you started your own Discord, right? Your own Discord server?
At this point, I haven't started any.
Okay. So sorry. So I guess you're very active in one, right?
I've inherited one,
Oh, okay.
and
That's what it is.
been trusted enough to be an administrator for another one that I'm more fairly active in.
Okay. And I guess just to sort of touch on group dynamics and stuff, have you sort of seen those experiences you had of sort of not getting as much feedback or just not having great experience with groups? Have you seen that sort of affect the way you're, I guess, running, for lack of a better word, the Discord groups that you're more involved in?
Absolutely, where there's, and of course there will always be the exception to the rule, but generally it's, well, if it's not a rule that's been posted up, well, you give them a warning. You don't just automatically kick them, ban them just because.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that will be the exception, because there will be those few members that will really test you on that.
Okay.
And it's not even for the going, oh, this person disagrees with me, I need to kick them. And it's like, no. It all comes down to be respectful to one another. Yeah, you may not share the same ideas when it comes to trans people and all of that, but at the same time, well, they're still human. Treat them like another human. Don't just think of them lesser because they have a different idea of how gender works than you.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think being able to keep that in the management of a group, I think, is important. It's cool to hear you've been able to do that in your work on there, which is great as well. Uh, so I think that answers my main questions. It's awesome how we got to cover sort of everything from your writing to your art. Uh, and I'm curious to know, is there anything we haven't touched on? Anything you want people to know about ChaosReacon, or anything you just want to throw out there, questions or ideas you wanted to sort of float to the community?
With that, just essentially treat everyone with respect. Obviously, not everyone's gonna give you respect, but be kind to each other. Be open to communicating. Sure, you don't have to be best buds with everyone, but at least be available to talk and at least listen to feedback, because if people is critiquing you, they don't hate you. Not all of them. It's only if you threaten people back will they start breeding more hatred, or breeding more of that they're going to constantly be on you because of how you act. But otherwise, be good to each other, and hopefully I can be more productive than I have been over the last year.
Yeah, I think it's always a place to start if you're looking to create more content. And it sounds like, as you mentioned, more Chatoru's Alchemy trials in the future to be expected. Tales of the Wasteland. Hopefully, you'll submit a story when I start the holiday contest come December time, which should be fun. It's always great to see what you write.
That's definitely something I need to keep on track more of whenever the contests start up again.
Yeah,
so
that
that
one.
I can actually start thinking of if I have an idea for said stories.
Yeah. I hope it's always great to see what you do. It's always creative, and I'm excited to see what sort of comes in the future from your writing and your art, which is awesome, and your administrative work across platforms, which is great too. But thank you very much, Chaos, for joining me. Always great to talk with you and learn more about your work and sort of the beginning of the fetish for you. As I said, I look forward to seeing what you do. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye for now, everybody.